Hi friends. Please subscribe and help me get my first 1,000 subscribers. It's one click for you, but for me it's a huge encouragement and motivation. Thank you to everyone who has already subscribed. I hope you enjoy this story. Let's go. The evening at the Westwood Grand Hotel was in full swing. Amid shimmering lights and the sound of a live orchestra, the guests moved through a spacious room filled with luxury and glitz. Alex Carter, a structural engineer of impeccable reputation, stood at the edge of the dance floor watching his wife's movements. Emily Stanton, a spectacular blonde in an emerald dress, glowed in the light of the chandeliers, laughing and exchanging flirtatious glances with colleagues and her boss, Richard Barnes. Alex clutched his champagne glass so that his knuckles turned white. At that moment Claire Winston, Emily's best friend and her constant companion at all events, approached. "Happy New Year, Alex," she exclaimed, rising on tiptoe to kiss him on the cheek. Alex turned away from her, barely touching her cheek with his lips, and looked straight into her brown eyes. Usually there was a sly light playing in them, but today a shadow of worry flickered in them. "Same scenario again, Claire?" Alex asked calmly but with an icy undertone. Claire frowned slightly and tried to smile. "Oh, don't be so stern. It's just a party. You know Emily is so lively and outgoing. She just needs some freedom." Alex laughed softly, but it was a bitter laugh. He took a step toward Claire, lowering his voice so that no one would hear. "Freedom? Freedom to stand under the mistletoe with every man in the room? The freedom to kiss Richard Barnes as if he were her husband? Or the freedom she allowed herself at every party?" Claire blushed and turned away. He knew she couldn't find the words to justify it. "Alex, she'll come home and explain everything. She's always saying how much she loves you." "Loves me?" He interrupted her with a nonchalant face. "Is her love measured by the number of cocktails she drinks a night and the number of kisses she shares with others?" At that moment, Alex's gaze fell on Emily. She was standing in the center of the circle of men, laughing as if something Richard had said was the wittiest joke in the world. She leaned toward him, her lips whispering something in the chief's ear, and he laughed loudly. "Look, Alex," Claire's voice shook, but she pulled herself together, "don't take it so hard. She'll come back to you, won't she?" "No, Claire," he cut her off. "Not this time." Alex took a step toward his table and pulled out a gift wrapped neatly in shiny paper. Tied beneath the center ribbon was his wedding band. He sighed, feeling oddly relieved. "Give this to Emily," he said, holding out the gift to Claire. "Let her know I made my choice." Claire tried to hold him back, clutching at his sleeve. "Alex, wait. Let me find her and bring her home. She's drunk again, you have to take her." "Don't worry, Claire," he replied with cold calmness. "She'll stay here. She's got a room booked long ago, where she's been partying all day while I've been working." Claire's eyes widened, but she couldn't find the words. Alex turned and headed for the exit. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he left behind a room full of music, laughter, and betrayal. When Claire approached Emily, her gaze was full of panic. "Emily, you have to see this." She handed her friend the gift, her voice trailing off. "Alex left this for you," she added. Emily shrugged, laughing. "Oh, Alex is always so dramatic. Leaving gifts so he can apologize later. I'm going to go talk to him and straighten this out." She opened the ribbon and the ring fell to the floor with a soft clatter. Emily frowned. "What is that?" Richard Barnes, standing nearby, bent down and picked up the ring, his smile crooked. "It looks like your wedding ring," he grinned. Emily froze, her hands trembling as she tore open the package. Glossy photographs fell out of the box. People around her began to pick them up and pass them to each other, and a deafening silence hung in the hall. Emily stood clutching the photos in her hands, her face turning ashy gray. She gulped convulsively for air as the audience around her fell silent, breathless. Richard Barnes slowly lowered the ring onto the table, his smug smile gone, replaced by grim seriousness. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered, glancing around at the guests, who were beginning to whisper and point fingers. Claire Winston, standing nearby, could feel everything falling apart. She tried to take Emily's elbow, but she pulled her arm away and took a step back. It's some kind of prank." Emily's voice was weak, breaking into a wail. She looked around like a hunted animal until her gaze came upon the elderly couple at the entrance, who were staring at the photographs in their hands in amazement. The woman exclaimed fearfully and the man grabbed her shoulder, silencing her. "Everyone here can rest assured that this is not a hoax," came a sharp, confident voice. Margaret Bailey emerged from the crowd, dressed in a strict black suit, her face impenetrable. She held a weighty folder of documents. "Who are you?" Richard tried to take control of the situation, but his voice treacherously shook. "Margaret Bailey, bailiff," she replied, heading toward Emily. Emily Stanton, you have been notified that divorce proceedings have begun. Here are the documents proving the adultery, as well as proof of financial claims from your husband, Alex Carter. Emily stared at the papers in silence, eyes wide. The crowd began to come alive. Whispers grew into exclamations of surprise and horror. People leaned toward the photographs that now lay on the floor, moving from one person to another. Someone took a step back, covering his mouth with his hand. Another woman turned to her husband with an icy stare. Did you know about this? Her voice cut through the noise like a blade. No. It's a mistake, the man began to justify himself, but his words were drowned out in a rumble of outraged voices. Richard stepped forward, trying to take Emily by the shoulder to pull her out of this hell. But she pulled back, her eyes meeting his. It wasn't so much anger as desperation and fear. Go away, Richard. You've done enough, she whispered. I was trying to protect you. His voice rang with fake concern, but it was fear for his own future. Margaret Bailey picked up one of the photographs and raised it above her head for all to see. It showed Emily in the arms of Richard and two other men from the company's management. She looked around the crowd, seeing the faces of the guests distorted with a mixture of shock and condemnation. This evidence will also be presented in court as proof of massive violations of ethics and corporate policy. I'm sure all concerned will want to reconsider their behavior before it's too late. At this point, panic broke out in the crowd. One of the men, noticing himself in the photo, tried to hide behind a column, but was caught by his wife's elbow. Do you think I'm blind, Tom? She shouted, waving the photograph in his face. All this time, you've been wasting our money and my trust on this. Sandra, please, let's discuss this at home, Tom pleaded, stretching his arms forward in a gesture of defense. At home? Ah. Sandra shoved him in the chest, causing him to stumble. The crowd was starting to move chaotically. People were arguing, whispering, some were heading for the exit, in a hurry to leave the scandal-filled hall. But there were also those who lingered to see the aftermath through to the end. Margaret handed the papers to Emily and added with professional candor. Your husband has also left for you a link to his website with a video and photo archive. These materials became available as tonight began. I advise you and everyone else in the room to familiarize yourselves with them to avoid further surprises. Emily, still standing among the scattered photos, slowly turned to Claire. She took a step back, averting her eyes. Did you know Claire? Did you know this was going to happen? Emily's voice was as dry as a whisper. Claire bit her lip, her eyes glistening with tears. I didn't think he'd go for it. I thought it would stay between the two of you. Emily lowered her head, unable to bear the stares of the assembled guests. She felt a wave of humiliation wash over her, making her body shake. The world spun and the sounds of voices became blurred as if in slow motion. Claire, still standing by her side, pretended to support her friend, but her own hands were shaking. Everybody get out of here. The party's over. Richard Barnes' voice exploded into the silence, causing another burst of panic. The guests looked around and some of them rushed for the exit. Their faces showed fear of being part of this scandal, fear of being exposed. Emily felt someone push her roughly to the side as a man in an expensive suit pushed past her, his eyes full of terror. Richard, what are we going to do? One of his coworkers walked up to him, looking around fearfully. It was David Holt, another top executive whose name was among those affected by the revelations. Richard looked around furiously, his face blazing with rage. We're going to save our own hides. We'll have a board meeting on Monday and figure out how to cover this up. He hissed, not noticing that several guests had heard him say it. Yeah. How are you going to explain that? There was sarcasm in his voice and everyone turned to Margaret Bailey. She stood with her arms crossed, her gaze burning. To the board of directors? They already know. Your time in office is up, Richard. Who told you that? Richard roared, stepping forward. Your father. He sent me here to oversee the process, Margaret said coldly. And don't act surprised. You knew this day would come. The words struck Richard like lightning. He froze, his fists clenched, but then a shiver ran through his body as he realized that his power had collapsed. He'd lost everything: respect, control, his impunity. Emily, hearing this, raised her eyes and looked at her superior. There was a shadow of hope in her eyes, but that faint ray of light had faded under the weight of reality. She realized that her connections would no longer help her, on the contrary, they were her curse. At that moment, a soft applause sounded behind Emily's back. Everyone turned and saw Alex Carter entering the hall, his gaze calm but coldly determined. Alex, Emily mumbled, her voice trailing off. He didn't answer. He walked past her as if she were a stranger. The guests retreated in front of him, clearing the aisle like a judge passing final judgment. You all knew this would happen, he said, addressing the room. But today at last the masks are off. Today each of you has seen the truth. The truth that I have learned over the last year. And I'm glad it's out in the open. Emily tried to step forward, but Claire grabbed her arm. Don't do it, she whispered. It's too late. No, it's not. Emily shouted, her voice growing louder. Alex, it was a mistake. All those stupid moments, they meant nothing to me. You are my life, you should know that. Alex looked at her, and his gaze was as cold as a winter night. A mistake? Emily, a mistake is a one-time slip-up. What you did was a conscious choice. And like any choice, it has consequences. At that moment, one of the guests coughed loudly, trying to lighten the mood. This set off a wave of laughter, muffled and nervous, which quickly died down. No one knew how to continue. Richard Barnes cast one last glance at Alex and headed for the exit, his back tense. He realized his glory days were over. David Holt followed him, muttering something to himself and avoiding meeting anyone's eyes. Alex turned to Emily and Claire again. Tears were in Claire's eyes, she knew they were both trapped in their own games. Alex, Claire started, but Alex interrupted her. You don't have to. He looked at both of them, his gaze full of regret and, finally, complete indifference. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Alex Carter left the cold, indifferent stares of the guests behind him and left the Westwood Grand, where the drama that would change the fates of many had just played out. He sat behind the wheel of his new black Chevrolet High Country Suburban, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly and his heart beating so hard it felt like it was about to burst. The engine rumbled like an animal ready to jump, and without a second's hesitation, Alex started up. His gaze slid to the rearview mirror, where he could still see the shining windows of the hotel, like the eyes of a giant, watching what was happening. Alex sighed, shifted his gaze forward and stepped on the gas. The night was deep and the roads were empty. The wide avenues of New York were replaced by dark suburban highways, where only rare streetlights lit the way. Alex turned on the radio, and the voice of a singer with a classic country tune sounded from the speakers. Emily had always hated that music, finding it old-fashioned and dull. He grinned and turned up the volume, enjoying the light guitar riff and the voice singing about freedom and new beginnings. The phone in his pocket vibrated, but Alex ignored it. He knew the messages would be full of pleas and excuses. Emily and her friend Claire might have already launched their own attack to soften the blow. But for him, this was the end of a long journey he'd chosen a year ago. Meanwhile, at the Westwood Grand Hotel, the remaining guests tried to recover from the shock. Margaret Bailey, who had taken on the role of guardian of justice, gathered up the remnants of photos and videos that had been strewn across the floor. Her phone lit up with an incoming message from one of the board members. Good work, Margaret. We'll start looking into the situation on Monday, she read aloud, but only to herself, smiling tiredly. It's over, one of the women said quietly, holding up a photograph of her husband hugging Emily in some forgotten office. It's just the beginning, sweetheart, the other one hissed, coming up behind her. Now we know who's who. The men who remained tried to pretend they were busy talking, but their eyes betrayed concern. Richard Barnes was gone, and with him the last shred of confidence that the scandal could be hushed up. Claire, standing against the wall, held Emily's hand, who was staring into the void, her face like a mask, pale and frozen. Emily, we need to get out of here, Claire whispered, trying to bring her out of her daze. Where? Emily's voice was desperate. Where am I going to go now? It's over. It's over. Yeah. You just walked away like I was nothing. We'll find a way out, Claire said, but her own words sounded unconvincing. She felt her world crumbling alongside her friends and realized that they were both left unprotected, like chess queens thrown onto a field with no pawns. The road took Alex farther and farther south, toward his new home and a new beginning. He was already going through in his mind the list of things to do when he arrived in Austin. Signing lease papers, discussing plans with new partners, looking at the local real estate markets. Not much left to do, he whispered to himself, looking out over the endless fields and the sparse houses lit by the soft light of the windows. The phone vibrated again. Alex finally reached for it, hoping to see a message from Margaret or one of his business associates. But the screen showed a name he knew painfully well. Emily. He put the phone back down without opening the messages. The past had to stay in the past and nothing could bring back what had been lost. In New York, the lights were still on in Richard Barnes' office. He sat there, breathing heavily and circling his eyes over the photographs that had been left behind after the party. His secretary, a woman in her 40s with a serious face, entered the room with a cup of coffee. "Sir, I think you should go home. Tomorrow will be even harder," she said, leaving the cup on the table. "Tomorrow?" Richard hummed and raised his eyes to the secretary. "There might not be a tomorrow for me." Alex Carter drove into Austin as the first rays of the sun colored the horizon in soft shades of pink and orange. The city greeted him with a calmness so different from the feverish activity of New York. The soft morning light, the aromas of freshly brewed coffee wafting from the small eateries, and the occasional passerby strolling down the street all filled Alex with a sense of peace. Here, in this new place, he could finally forget about the dramas and intrigues left behind. Stopping at a stoplight, he looked at the map. His apartment was in a new residential complex in the center of the city, overlooking the river and parks drowning in greenery. Alex felt a slight rush of excitement. This was the beginning of a new chapter that he had been planning for a long time without even realizing it. Margaret Bailey was sitting at her desk in New York watching the news. The scandal surrounding Barnes & Company was heating up with renewed vigor. The publication of photos and videos related to Emily and other high-profile individuals had led to mass layoffs and numerous lawsuits. Margaret's gaze fell on a message from an old friend of hers. "Margaret, you should have seen Richard's face when he realized the company was no longer his. Great job." She smiled. For a long time she'd known that these men used their positions for personal gain, disregarding decency and honesty. But what pleased her most was the certainty that Alex Carter, her former coworker and a man of integrity, had managed to break free of that vicious cycle. Alex finally reached his new apartment. It was spacious and bright, with large windows overlooking the river. On the kitchen table was a note from his new partners. "Welcome, Alex. There's going to be a little pool party tonight. Come and meet the others. Jim and Susan." He grinned. The last party he'd been to had turned into a nightmare, but something about this invitation had been reassuring. Things were different here. The people he was about to meet were partners he could count on. Taking a glass of water, Alex looked out the window thoughtfully. Austin was a city of opportunity, and he felt that here he had a chance to build a new life. A life in which there would be no place for lies and betrayal. Evening descended on the city, bringing with it a light breeze. Alex, dressed in a simple shirt and jeans, headed to the rooftop pool. People were already gathering there. The laughter and clinking of champagne glasses created an atmosphere in which he wanted to relax. He went to the counter and took a glass of cool beer. "Alex, good to see you." A tall man with a tanned face walked up to him and extended his hand. "I'm Jim, one of your new partners. I hope you like Austin?" "Very much." Alex smiled and shook his hand. "This place is amazing. I feel at home here already." "That's good. We have a team looking for a leader like you." Jim winked and turned to the woman standing next to him. "This is Susan, our marketing woman and simply the light of our company." Susan, a woman with a warm smile and eyes full of sincerity, extended her hand. "Alex, I heard about your work in New York. They lost a great specialist. But for us it's a big deal." "Thank you, Susan," Alex said, feeling slightly embarrassed. "I'm glad to be here too. I want to put the past behind me and start something new." She nodded, understanding him without words. "Then just rest today," she said, taking his hand and leading him to the circle of new acquaintances. "Tomorrow we'll make plans and conquer new heights." At this time in New York, Emily Stanton sat in her empty apartment. Everything was cold and lifeless. Her career was ruined and the friends that surrounded her before were starting to disappear like smoke. A message from Claire popped up on her phone screen. "Emily, I'm sorry. Everything is falling apart. Albert's gone and I can't stay in town anymore. I'm going to Europe. Take care of yourself." Emily threw the phone on the couch and covered her face with her hands. Tears ran down her cheeks, hot and bitter. She remembered the night Alex, her husband, had stood before her with an expression of pain and disappointment. Her heart had been broken, but she hadn't realized at that moment that she had lost him forever. "Why was I so stupid?" she whispered to herself. In the silence, her question echoed with no answer. Alex sat by the pool, listening to the stories of his new friends and looking at the reflection of stars in the water. He felt the tension of the last few years fading away, like a light breeze taking away the remnants of old pain. Susan laughed as she recounted a funny incident at work, and her laughter was infectious. "So, Alex, how was your first day?" she asked, noticing his thoughtfulness. "Best day I've had in a long time," he answered honestly, raising his glass in gratitude. A new life and new horizons awaited him here in Austin. And that concludes our story today. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like and leave a comment. Also, we are always happy to discuss any comments you may have. See you in the next video.